So now we have an abundance of tomatoes at last. I've got to be able to preserve them and use them in as many ways as I can. So we do a lot of big cook-ups of spag bol and chilies and things like that. So we use a lot of tinned tomatoes. We also use a lot of ketchup. We just love tomatoes all year round, but you're never going to be able to preserve them fresh. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put them in my dehydrator, and you end up with dried tomatoes, which are really good for preserving. You can freeze them as well to keep them for longer. And when you want to use them, you can rehydrate them just by putting them in water. And so you can also powder them. So you end up with tomato powder, and tomato powder is really zesty and concentrated and sweet and delicious concentrated tomato flavour, and that can be used in everything you cook. And you can reconstitute it with a bit of water to turn it into like a tomato paste, tomato puree. So I'm going to use most of the sort of similar sized tomatoes that I've picked out of our crop, and I'm going to dehydrate them on this tray. Dehydrating is great because it's just really low temperature cooking that allows a lot of ventilation, so the evaporation process can happen. And it's not very high heat, so you preserve a lot of the enzymes and a lot of the vitamins and nutrients in the tomatoes. So it's not cooking, it's like raw food. You're preserving all the nutrients. But it can take quite a while, and you do need, the best thing is to use a proper dehydrator. You can use an oven, but you have to keep the door open to allow the water evaporating to escape. So I think I'm going to cut into, I could either do thirds, but they do end up a bit, see how small they are? This is a slice, and this is a half. There's another half. Really not much fluid left in these at all, which is how they can be preserved, because they won't go off. So I think I'm going to do thirds, actually. So, like that. Trying to get the same thickness so they all cook at the same time, or dehydrate at the same rate. Does take a while because tomatoes are very juicy. There's a lot of water to evaporate. If you wanted to, for a snack and a crisp alternative, you could, let's take a bigger one, using the bigger tomatoes. They work better. Yeah, big juicy one. They work better for crisps. And then what you do is slice about 1/4 of an inch. It's always that pesky end. It's quite hard to pierce the skin. And then if you did a whole tray of those laid out like that, you will end up with these thin tomatoey crisps. You could actually put some seasoning on them as well. They're delicious, and they do crunch and crackle. So I might do that if I've got space left on my tray. The beauty of dehydrating is that you can just leave it. You set the temperature and leave it going, and then check it every now and then. You might need to switch the trays around because the ones at the top will get drier quicker as heat will rise. Once this is full, we can take it to the dehydrator. So this is the dehydrator, and it's got a fan at the back, has a dial at the top to set different temperatures, but they're all very low temperatures. And there's a different drying time and temperature depending on what you're doing. So for fruit, which is quite water heavy, it needs a longer drying time, but it's also slightly higher temperature because it can take it. You make sure when you load them up that you're not squashing everything in too tight, so there's room for the air to circulate. The sides are sealed, but the lid, the door, is very loose fitting, and that's by design. That's by design because you want the air to circulate. You don't need it to be a hot oven. Okay, so they're in, and I'm going to set it to 135 degrees Fahrenheit or 57 degrees centigrade. And it's a little noisy, which is why it's in the other room, not in the kitchen. And then you just forget about it and check it maybe every 6 hours. Or it'll take about 12 to 24 hours, depending on the humidity and the climate that you're in. Sometimes it's quicker if it's really dry, sometimes it's slower if it's really humid. So we'll come back and check and see what they're like. So these have just come out of the dehydrator, and you can see how much smaller they are in comparison to the other tomatoes. Even these little tiny small orange cherry ones have dehydrated to nothing. But the thing is, you've lost the water content, or most of the water content, but you have concentrated the flavour. So what you're getting for that little bit of tomato is way, way more than its size in terms of flavour. These ones are not as dehydrated to the point of a crisp. You can dehydrate them to the point of a crisp. You hear that? So they are really, really dry. There's no, you can snap them. There's no sort of not much flexibility. And when you reduce the moisture completely, they won't spoil. They won't go off very easily. So you can store these in a cupboard. And these are without any moisture content. These are much, much easier to powder. So you can blitz them in your blender and powder them up, and then use them, as I said before, in sort of making pastes and as a flavouring, or even a sort of a flavouring for things like wedges and crisps, homemade crisps. But these ones are soft, so I'm going to put these ones in the freezer, and then when I want to use them, I'll take out however many I want, put them in some water, they'll rehydrate, and even that water that they're in will become tomatoey and juicy. Use them in any way you want, like you would a tin of tomatoes, let's say. But if you're growing a lot of tomatoes, there's a lot of this going on. This is a lot of effort to slice it, to lay it all out, to dehydrate it. It uses up a lot of energy. And look, I've still got a whole load of tomatoes, and there's more to come. So apart from what we would eat in our everyday life, I would probably chuck these in a bag and put them in the freezer. And whenever I need them, I will pull out, whenever I need to use tomatoes in soups and stews and things like that, I'll pull them out, defrost them in a bowl of hot water, skins peel off nice and easy, and you just chuck them in your pastas and everything else you want to use chopped tomatoes in. Easy. But sometimes you think, well, God, why do we go to all this effort? Why can't, when you're growing tomatoes, why go to all this effort to try and preserve it? It's because you cannot get the flavour that you get in these tomatoes from shop bought tomatoes. You just can't. And I want to have that flavour all year round. If I'm growing plenty, and usually if you do it good, you get a bumper crop of tomatoes, you've always got some to give away, loads to make foods with, and to preserve for later. So it's really worth going to all that effort just to get the unbelievable power-packed flavour that you get from these things. They are delicious.